Welcome to the second session of our panel, Beyond Coercion, Emulation, Competition and Learning, the Frontiers of Causal Mechanisms in Research on Social Policy Diffusion. This panel is jointly organized by Amanda Schreiwers and me, Johanna Kuhlmann, both from the University of Bremen. We are very happy that we have the opportunity to discuss our research here, and also we would like to thank again Osmani and his team for their huge efforts in bringing this conference online. We have three very interesting papers today by Amanda Schreiwers, Connie from the University of Bremen, and Stephen Devereux from the Institute of Development Studies, and Anna Wolkenhauer, also from the University of Bremen. I will say a few sentences regarding the structure. So the structure of the panel is that each presentation will be followed by a short discussion by me and then additional questions from the audience. Then the presenters can briefly respond to the points raised in the discussion, and then we move on to the next paper. Okay, so after these organizational details, let me already hand over to Amanda for the first presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Johanna. Let me just share my screen, so everyone, if you can bear with me for just a moment. All right. Okay, right, great. All right, great. Hopefully that's fine. And since I'm sharing my screen, I can't really see the rest of the presenters or anyone watching, unfortunately. So I'm relying on everyone to just shout if something's going wrong or is unclear. So thanks so much for joining us. Like Johanna said, we're really delighted to have the second session today. My paper is entitled British Colonial Development Assistance, Social Construction, Coercion, Competition, or Learning. And like many things during COVID, it took a slightly different turn than expected before presentation at this conference. So clearly, for those that have had a chance to look at the paper, it's formulated very much like a book chapter right now, and it's focused really on the historical elements of the Colonial Development Act and the corresponding Colonial Development Fund and Colonial Development Advisory Committee that grew out of the Act. So it's largely a sort of historical look at how this first legislative and systematic effort to distribute development assistance across the British colonies came together, and with a focus on the mechanism through which that happened. And to sort of bring this together for the panel, I tried to focus more on these themes of social construction, coercion, competition, and learning in a short section at the end. And with the project that I'm working on at Bremen, I think we will probably explore these themes much further as we move into some casework for our project. So I'm really looking forward to any questions and comments, and also really grateful to the other two papers in the panel today that I think touch on really critical transnational issues that are really important to consider in diffusion, including in a colonial context. And I'm really interested in how best to kind of adapt our thinking to that new environment. So again, the paper is really taking an historical approach to understanding this theme of diffusion in a colonial context. And I put diffusion in quotes because I'm not so sure that's really the best way to describe it, but I'll circle back to that at the end. The main finding of the paper was really, for me, that Britain's 1929 Colonial Development Act, it really aligned with and built upon previous notions of colonial development as economic development. So this was a redistributive mechanism, but in my view, it was really far from socially progressive in many respects. And in this way, the main argument of the paper is that the Colonial Development Act was really part and parcel of fundamentally contradictory claims about the British Empire. So on the one hand, the British Empire wanted to be perceived as a benevolent hegemon, and it was very protective of this image, as the paper comes to find. But on the other hand, I would argue that ultimately the Colonial Development Act and the financing that was a part of it and distributed throughout the colonies really supported prioritizing metropolitan economic gains over and at the expense of the welfare of local and indigenous populations in British colonies in many cases. So just a couple words first about colonial policy or social policy in a British colonial development context, as I call it. A few things that are important to note, just a bit of background. I won't focus on this much because I know we don't have much time, but British colonies within the empire were meant to be financially self-sufficient entities. And this was a critical element for colonial governors' performance within their colonies, and a lot hinged on this, including their advancement to other positions in the empire. So being financially self-sufficient was critical. And Britain's approach toward colonial development policy really emerged and began to crystallize at the end of the 19th century under Secretary of State for the Colonies, Joseph Chamberlain. And his vision of colonial development was that this would be state-enabled, but largely privately driven. So the idea was that, you know, the state had a role to play in going in to help build infrastructure, communication, transportation, these kinds of things that multiple private entities needed to have built, but no single one of them was in a position to really develop within each colony. And further to that, the idea was that the state and the empire really had a duty and a responsibility to develop this, quote, great estate to which Britain had been entrusted. And this notion of trusteeship really carried on post-World War II, particularly at the League of Nations and in other environments going forward. So after World War I and before the Great Depression, just before, Britain passed the Colonial Development Act. And this act had two objectives. The first was to aid and develop agriculture and industry in Britain's colonies. And there were many explicit references to the hope that this act could reduce unemployment in Britain, though it was also widely known that that was perhaps rather overambitious. And the other goal was to promote commerce with or industry inside of the United Kingdom. The Act also explicitly allowed for the inclusion of public health as a priority. However, it excluded education from its view of the expenses that it was allowed to cover. The Act itself created two entities. The first was the Colonial Development Fund, and the second was the Colonial Development Advisory Committee. The fund essentially received £1 million from Parliament every year that had to be distributed throughout the colonies, and the Colonial Development Advisory Committee was created to give opinions on projects that were put forth by colonial governors that could be used or could be supported through the funds available in the CDF. I looked a lot into this committee with some research assistants from one of our students here at Bremen, Jakob Kaiser, and this committee was very interesting. I won't go into great detail, but it was a very stable entity comprised of about 10 individuals. They had experience in finance, trade, union organization, chartered accounting, engineering, public works. Some of them were former colonial governors, and they were also members of key firms, including things like De Beers, Consolidated Mines, Cable and Wireless, key firms that had interests throughout the empire, essentially. However, none of them really had experience with social or health services. So social policy was marginal sort of in the experience of these individuals, even if they were very sympathetic to wanting to fund endeavors to do with social policy from the CDF. To give you a sense of the mechanism through which this worked, essentially British colonies, through colonial governors, would send applications for financing from the CDF to the Secretary of State for the Colonies. And as long as the Secretary of State for the Colonies had no objections, these applications were sent directly to the Colonial Development Advisory Committee. The committee then simultaneously, importantly, sent their recommendations both to the Treasury and also to the Colonial Office. And the Colonial Office had an opportunity to include comments on the recommendations from the Colonial Development Advisory Committee before this was finally sent to the Treasury for final approval and review, and presumably for the release of funds to the colonies for the projects that they had requested if they had received a favorable review from the Colonial Development Advisory Committee. So this is essentially how this mechanism worked. So I know we're short on time, so we'll get straight to the four key themes and sort of my reflections on them in the paper. Social construction. So I think this is a critical theme to consider in the context of British colonial development, but it was clear that sort of those that were in more privileged positions really did the constructing of the law itself, of the funds, of the ideas and rules that were created to decide which projects were, sort of allowed to be funded by the CDF and not. Whilst others, particularly indigenous populations or even local populations within colonies, were really the subject of these constructions. This was not a participatory process that was equitable. That's not sort of what was going on here. And so in this way, I think it's important to realize that social construction is very much a political project. This was not an equitable exercise. And that was a critical part of the colonial operation in Britain and also elsewhere. The theme of coercion. I think here, many of these traditional aspects of coercion, particularly a physical use of force, was so different in a colonial context that I'm not so sure it's really comparable to the discussion of coercion that's going on in the between nation states and in the current literature. So I sort of set that to one side. But I think ideas about, hegemonic ideas clearly played a critical role in the construction of the principles behind the CDA, specifically those that were used to decide whether or not projects were allowed to be funded or not from this pot of money. And there were also interesting principal agent issues here, where oftentimes local actors and colonial governors had a lot of agency and very little oversight or support from metropolitan actors within the empire. And this led to interesting sort of ad hoc policy making or quite creative solutions really to problems that colonial administrators faced within their particular colony. And in this way, I think colonial governors were also very much vehicles through which policies traveled and actually sort of intentionally moved throughout the empire. That's one finding here. And I think this is something that we need to consider, particularly in the casework and the projects that I'm working on going forward. Because oftentimes if a colonial governor had managed to sort of solve a problem in one environment, so to speak, in the eyes of metropolitan actors, they were intentionally moved to a new context in which they were experiencing a similar issue with the hopes that the experience of this individual would sort of help to address the problem at hand. And the final two themes, competition was interesting because I think this appeared to be less of an issue between colonies and applying for funds from the CDF, and it wasn't really a key driver of colonial development assistance. But I suspect that this may have been an issue more between empires. And in this way, I think there are probably some underlying principles about differences between these mechanisms between nation states and within territories and empires, which is a very different situation. So I think if I took a little bit more time to think through this, that might be one area where we could get to some identifying some key distinctions between how transnational mechanisms sort of work between full-on nation states and how similar sort of cross-territorial mechanisms might operate between dependent territories and metropolitan arenas. And learning, policy learning. This was also an interesting area where I think it's important to distinguish between technical developments in policy and also really political learning kind of in the way. And the example that I'm pointing to here is to do with health. So there were a lot of advancements in the scientific arena, particularly germ theory. And these were really political hot topics at the International Sanitary Committee meetings in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And it's really interesting to read many of the meeting minutes from those times because they're not really unlike some of the debates that we see today with COVID. They were very concerned with controlling infectious disease, preventing outbreaks. These were critical topics on the international agenda to do with health. And really, once germ theory and technologies related to it received, wide acceptance and had achieved an authoritative position within the scientific and the policy and political realms, you saw really big changes here. And I think health was quickly realized as an area that that had to be built upon, was a clear way for the CDA to fund priorities that supported welfare in ways that were required, both by external actors such as the League of Nations and also within territories in a way that led to, again, a strong perception of the empire. And I think the final finding of the paper really was that changes within welfare provision within the British Empire only actually shifted once this image of Britain as a benevolent hegemon was threatened. And from there forward, they started to sort of focus more on welfare provision as the act moved on. So those are just some of my reflections, I guess, starting on these four themes going forward. And I just look forward to ideas and thoughts about how to take this work forward. And thanks for the opportunity to present today. And I'll turn it back over to Johanna from there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Amanda. This is really a very nice paper. It was also extremely well written, extremely interesting to learn more about this particular case. And I think what is especially important is that you clearly remind us how important the historical context is when we talk about social policy developments. And also, of course, the paper sheds light on an aspect that has probably not received enough attention in the comparative social policy literature, namely the role of colonialism. I have 3 comments regarding your paper, but since I understand that your paper is already rather well, or I understand that it's already nearly finished and is going to be a book chapter. So some of my comments are also maybe rather broad comments, and then I also have some questions. So first, what I found really interesting when I read your paper was your description of social policy as integral to mechanisms of othering. And I was wondering if you could maybe describe this a little bit more. Also, I think it would be very interesting to learn if this is something that is very special with regard to the British colonial empire, or is it something that you think applies to colonialism in general, maybe also to French colonialism? I mean, clearly this aspect of social policy as a mechanism of othering, I would be really curious to hear your thoughts on that. Second, you already talked a little bit about this now in your presentation, but I would be interested to learn more about this, because this is also an aspect that Anna and Stephen will later touch upon in their paper. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of individual agency in this process? You mentioned in your presentation the colonial governors as vehicles of diffusion processes, and I think it's really great, to think this through more. And I would be curious to hear if you know more about the exact role that this individual agents played in shaping social policy development. And then my final point refers to the role of mechanisms, because this is also something that we aimed to, or we focused on, or we wanted to focus on, especially in this panel. And I think it was a very nice reflection that you included at the end of your chapter and of your presentation, where you clearly show where the different diffusion mechanisms fit, but also, maybe this is even more important, where they don't really fit. And I was wondering, now that you have shown us the boundaries of the different mechanisms, what do you think is the alternative? I mean, I know it's a very broad question, but against the background of your specific case, do you think that these mechanisms can still be useful? Is this typology still useful, or would you rather say, okay, this typology maybe in order to capture broader historical processes, particularly it needs to be replaced by a different typology, or should we maybe aim to look for smaller scale mechanisms? I mean, what are your thoughts on this rather general aspect? I would be really curious to learn more about that. Yes, I think that's it, Amanda. I look forward to your answers.
Sure, I'll just be brief, but thanks so much for the challenging questions to the paper. I mean, I'll take them in order, just one at a time, and offer a few reflections. I think I don't know that I'll have full answers right now, but it's a good exercise to think through. On the mechanisms of othering, I sort of conveniently don't go into all of the details of what these mechanisms might look like and what they are, but I think really it's this idea of social construction that made me sort of think down this path, that, it wasn't, that there were clear logics in imperial ways of thinking, and particularly indigenous populations. We know this because of current discourses still on race and ethnicity and the ways in which these are determinants of things like health and well-being to date. I mean, these are historic issues and probably part of the legacies that still need to be considered going forward from a critical angle, to learn about also how to prevent this kind of othering and how to address it really in policy going forward. But you can see in the way that actors, really largely through ideas and somewhat through institutions as well, but there was a clear construction of the quote other, who was sort of deserving, we would say now, maybe of social policy or not. And these are things that we talk about usually, I find, in social policy literature in relation to poverty. and oftentimes in a lot of sociological literature as well, but I think they're distinct sort of ideational lines. Usually people point to race and ethnicity within colonial empires in which this was happening. And I think that's a key thing to consider. I know Karina, in her paper last week on this panel, really pointed to some even better distinctions here. And I would need to sort of look back at the paper to see that, because I also think othering is context specific. I think oftentimes in a domestic policy context, when we talk about it in relation to social policy, again, it's mostly to do with poverty reduction, and that also happens in the foreign policy arena. But I think particularly between the global north and the global south, I mean, I think some international relations scholars have pointed to ways in which institutions are still a product of their colonial legacies, and ways that othering might happen differently in that context. So I think that's just an interesting thing to consider, and I need to think more about the specifics of that going forward. So thanks so much for the comment. On individual agency, I think this is a critical issue, and that there's sets of literature that have not fully come together here yet, because I think for people that have worked on looking at policy and decision making within colonies, they've recognized for a while now that colonial governors and actors on the ground within colonies, oftentimes were really quite divorced from actors in the metropolitan arena. This was not always a well-planned, coordinated effort to control territories and carry out certain operations. Oftentimes it was ad hoc, it was under-resourced, it was not done in communication with metropolitan centers. And so I think there's some principal agent sort of problems here, as some would call them, but also differences between kind of actors and their agents, as really Anna and Stephen later in our panel, they deal with this issue much more thoroughly, and I think really, really well. So I was really delighted to read that. So I almost want to sort of send you to their work for a much more thorough discussion of some of these issues to date, but just to say that I think these issues also play out within colonial contexts, and I'm interested to look at that in the cases that we'll look at in the project going forward. As far as the typology of mechanisms go, I think the real key here for me is this issue that, diffusion, to me, the term, even this kind of scientific metaphor, suggests that it's some sort of natural process that happens. And I think as the papers today throughout the panel show, I mean, it's really not that, in my view. I think it's very much a political and a social process that's living and happening, that's created, by actors, even if they're in an institutional context, even if they feel that their political options are rather constrained by the context in which they find themselves. This is still very much a human and a social project, I think, in my mind. So I think this passive notion of diffusion, that's often kind of one directional in nature too, I struggle with, I think. I think causal mechanisms are a good way forward, as well as these actor-centric approaches and finding something therein. But I think the key too is to consider that the limits to some extent, I think, of actors' behavior are to do with the options that we are willing to sort of conceive of from the outset. So there's a certain imaginatory sort of aspect to this, I think. I think it's really critical that even if we get to be quite empirically specific, I hate to say positivist, but empirically specific with the way in which policy processes came together through things like process tracing, I think it's important to recognize that there are always options we haven't considered, that there might be uncertainty in a context that we need to fully account for. So I think it's great if we can get more specific about mechanisms, particularly in historical reconstructions and work. But I think we also need to just account for uncertainty in that equation. And certainly within colonial operations on the ground, there's a great deal of uncertainty. There was a lack of data, a lack of lines of communication, a lot of unknowns that people were addressing. And I think we need to make sure to leave space for that in the empirical work that we do when trying to understand these historical contexts. I think that's it from my side. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. That was very helpful. That was very interesting. I think I will just hand over to the second paper and to Connie's presentation.
Okay, I think I was muted. So I will start. Okay. Good afternoon, and thank you for accepting my paper and organizing this panel. It's a great opportunity, especially for PhD students, to present our work. So today I'm gonna present you about the paper entitled Ship of Theseus, a policy transfer paradox of the ILO maternity protection standards. So the Ship of Theseus is a Greek metaphor, refers to the question whether identity could be still sustained after the major components of it is removed or replaced by the other components. So here I would say the ILO maternity protection standards are like a ship of Theseus. So at the end of the policy transfer process, the major components will be detached. And I wonder whether it's actually effective or not. So not surprisingly, there are a lot of literature about the effectiveness of ILO standards because ILO is one of the oldest labor organizations, provide a set of international standards. And maternity protection has been one of the core standards of ILO that has been introduced when ILO was founded. So one group of study argues that nation states' exposures or ratification of ILO conventions would be led to adoption or development of social policies. However, the other group of scholars would argue the ILO convention or ILO standards would not be effective for the improvement on social expenditure and social policy labor rights in practice. So what does this literature tells us? I thought, so if you see that, like first, regarding the changes by law, ILO standards often have impact on it. However, in terms of the labor rights and policy, it's ambiguous whether ILO standards could actually influence it or not. So I saw the possibility that perhaps the ILO standards, the impact of ILO standards are stripped down in the process of the policy transfer process. So in this panel, we talk about diffusion mechanism, but I suggest maybe perhaps we should look into what's transferred rather than how it is transferred. So I would like to argue that especially the stripping down process is like a policy failure, which was termed by policy transfer literature, meaning that nation states formally adopt the foreign policy model or international standards, but the effectiveness of policy transfer is limited. So it is important to ask the question in which degree actually policy model is transferred. So I found two types of policy transfer. So first one is nation states only accept elements of policy model selectively, and especially if they omit the standards that would determine the success of the policy model, it will be considered as incomplete transfer. And the effectiveness of foreign policy model could be further hindered by the implementation challenges. So, for example, the case is that contextual factors of recipient countries differ too much from the conceptual factors of host countries. The application of prototype would be challenged. So the aim of this study is basically to empirically capture these two different types of policy failure. So, as I told you, maternity protection is one of the symbolic conventions among ILO because it was the first maternity protection convention was adopted in the year ILO was founded. And then every 3 years, ILO updated the standard of the conventions. And already a lot of case studies or the empirical study in specific region, empirical study, they already found the significant impact of the ILO maternity protection conventions on shaping maternity leave policies in the world. And they mostly rely on the social construction theory or, social construction theory because they emphasize the strong legitimacy of the ILO maternity convention actually brought the changes of state behavior. So ILO is, as I told you, one of the most important standard setter in the field, and especially in terms of maternity protection, it has been the only standard setter about maternity protection until 1992. So, however, it is not clear whether they were also effective in improving maternity protection in practice. My argument would be it would not have been very effective due to two reasons. So first of all, the ILO's main instrument to implement international standards in the world heavily relies on persuasion or supervision. The strongest sanction would be complaint procedure that they could bring to international Court of Justice. However, this has been only rarely employed. And in case of supervision, it's not strong enough to actually standardize the national policy to international standards, because there is no systematic mechanism, especially to control or monitor the policy outcomes. And also, it is expected that international standards would be hard to apply, particularly in low and middle-income countries. So the way the international standards are set in ILO, at least until 1980s, was they upload the high-income countries policy model, and then it will be set as a ILO standards to solve the problem in middle and low-income countries as well. However, in this process, the low and middle-income countries has limited opportunity to participate in the standard setting process. So my strategy here is to compare the ILO standards with the policy outcome in 165 countries. So I built the data set to measure the paid maternity leave law in the world from late 19th century till 2018. So I will compare whether they actually follow the ILO standards shortly after the ILO conventions. And then I will compare the policy outcome and policy output to show the implementation challenges, especially in terms of enforcement problem in informal sector. So to capture the incomplete transfer, as I told you, I traced the states change along in terms of the ILO Maternity Protection Conventions. So the ILO standards have 5 different dimensions: amount of benefit, duration of benefit, coverage and financing, and also the introduction of social assistance. And as you can see, the standard updated every in higher conventions. And surprisingly, for example, in second convention, they already suggested nation states to introduce social assistance policy in 1952 to fix the lack coverage problem. So this figure shows the relative number of introduction and reforms by the number of independent states. And here you can see shortly after the first and second and third convention, the amount of benefit or duration of benefit, coverage or method of financing of paid maternity leave in the world changed shortly after the convention. However, in case of social assistance, there are only a very few countries, especially high-income countries, conform to this standard. So here, I would say there has been incomplete transfer, especially in terms of introduction of the social assistance. And I suggest 2 potential reasons. One is the low plausibility of policy model. For example, it was U.S. and General Director's decision to include the introduction of social assistance as part of the international standards to solve lack coverage problem. However, at that time, only half of the country among low and middle income countries had introduced the social assistance system, which means to comply with this standard, they have to introduce social insurance and at the same time social insurance system, because social assistance system was to complement the lack coverage of the social insurance system. So the model already had kind of low plausibility itself, and it was also lacked of the consensus, because normally ILO would ask nation states about their opinion for the previous convention. What do you think about previous convention? Do you think the standards should be updated or not? So it would increase the legitimization of the standards and also to increase the plausibility of the standards. However, such procedure did not occur in case of the introduction of social assistance program because it was not part of last convention. So it was just US's support and also the imagination of ILO staff about the solution for the leg coverage. And also there was no proper justification or adjustment for this standard during the discussion. So for example, Pakistan argued, okay, let's restrict the scope only to the countries where such standards exist, but the United States has said, okay, it weakens the text of convention, but there was no further justification for this standard, which is not very usual in case of the discussion process. So to capture the implementation challenges, I especially wanted to capture the enforcement problem in terms of the typical sector. So the challenges of the enforcement, particularly in a typical sector, would challenge the implementing the international standards. So I compared the expected coverage and effective coverage. So I calculated expected coverage. For example, if the country covers women workers in industrial and non-industrial and agricultural sector, then the first expected coverage would be the actual ratio of these three sectors. However, I built the second coverage data, which assumes that regardless whether the country covered a typical sector, it would, by law, it would not cover. So I built the second set of variable, which already assumed that the atypical employment, women in atypical employment would not be covered. And I compared this with the proportion of female workers who would potentially receive the maternity cash benefits. So I could see whether the country actually cover what the employment sector they promised. And as you can see, actually, a large proportion of low and middle income countries cover all sector, so agriculture, industrial, commercial, as well as a typical sector. However, in reality, only high income countries, they say they cover all, and they actually do in practice. However, in case of low and middle income countries, they often make fake promises. And if we apply the exaggerated assumption that they would not cover a typical sector regardless they promise, then we can see more correlation between the expected coverage and effective coverage. In similar logic, I built the maternity entitlement score based on the conditions of maternity law. And I compared this with the expenditure. And as you can see, only in case of high-income countries, the legal condition is correlated with the expenditure, which does not hold in case of the low and middle income countries. So I did the condition effect to see whether GDP per capita actually influence or condition the correlation effect between the expenditure entitlement, which turns out to be true. So, for example, in the countries with higher GDP per capita, you can see the correlation between the maternity expenditure and entitlement. However, in case of the low income countries, such correlation does not hold anymore. So the conclusion is the policy transfer or policy diffusion process is indeed like a ship of Theseus. So even if states adopt the international standard or they change the law, it would not necessarily mean it would be effective in policy practice. So I would argue there are more these policy transfer approaches are required, which means we should more look into the contents of the policy that has been diffused. And I hope there will be more spaces for methodological innovation along our development of new data, a more sophisticated data set. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. That is a very interesting, very important paper, and I really think you have impressive empirical data. It's very, very nice to read, and I especially like your focus on both stages of the policy cycle, so both policy adoption and policy implementation. I think this is really great, as especially policy implementation is often being neglected, and yeah, that you consider these both stages together is really great for the paper, I think. Yeah, I also think that your paper is also pretty advanced, and I will keep my comments relatively short. My first comment refers to the title of your paper when you talk about this policy transfer paradox. I think this is this is a very nice concept, but I was wondering what this exactly refers to. Is this paradox the fact that there's a tension between policy adoption or policy implementation, or what exactly is this policy transfer paradox? And then I also like that you analyze the whole process in terms of policy failure. You characterize the fact that the 3 ILO maternity protection conventions have been transferred in the world only to a limited extent as policy failure, which then results from both incomplete policy adoption and implementation challenges. And I was wondering, I know that this might of course hold true for the respective instrument that the ILO is promoting, and that is also the focus of your paper, of course, but do you know anything about alternative instruments, or maybe also informal arrangements that exist in countries that do not adopt this convention, or that do not adopt these policies, that can also protect mothers? And then, finally, regarding the conclusions, I think you show very nicely what broader implications your study has for the study of policy transfer, and also, probably for the role of comparative social policy. And now in your presentation, you mentioned that there's a lot of space for methodological innovation. And I was wondering if you have some ideas on what this methodological innovation could exactly look like. That would be really interesting. I'm sure you have some ideas on that.
Okay, that's a hard question. I have to think more about the title, actually, because I got some comments that I have to apply the policy transfer literature a little bit more, or use the terms of policy failure. So I studied it, and then I tried to incorporate it. And in that process, I might have used the terms quite ambiguously. So obviously, this is a working on progress paper, so I will improve it. Thank you. And then about the second point, policy failure. So alternative instrument of nation state who does not accept the standards of ILO, what would that be? So for example, in case of African countries, like they do have a statutory provision for the maternity protection. However, that has very little impact on African women because they don't cover informal workers. So that leaves like almost only 10% of entire employed women would have the right to maternity protection. In this case, you have to either rely on your kinship or informal network, like you have to rely on mercy of employer and such things. So I would say there are not, to be very honest, that there are not many spaces that you, in terms of maternity protection, other than what ILO suggests, because they even include like social assistance as one of the solutions. So except for social assistance, social insurance, or except for statutory provision, they're not. I'm not so sure what you can really rely on. But yeah, but recently there are a lot of study about that from the African region. So maybe I will look into that as well. And about the methodological innovation, I had actually really trouble to prove that this is a convergence or this is due to ILO, because it is a very long process. And also it's very unclear it's very unclear how to prove that this is a convergence or general improvement. So one way I thought about convergence tests, but that was not also clear enough. So I relied on more or less on the timing. Even if I kind of tried to step forward from previous studies by disaggregating the ILO convention. So for example, existing study would say any improvement on, for example, labor policy would belong to effectiveness of ILO. And I was trying to avoid that by disaggregating the policy contents into 5 dimensions that ILO standard was promoting. But I would say still that's not enough. I think either you have to rely on more sophisticated convergence tests, or you really have to look into, for example, parliamentary debate and see whether they actually mention about ILO or such, using probably machine learning or something like that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. And I think we will hand over to the third paper now by Anna and Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Johanna, and thanks and hello to everyone who's joining us here today. Let me share my presentation. All right, I hope you can see it now. Otherwise, please interrupt. I'm not able to read any comments. Right, so the paper that I'm presenting today by Stephen Devereux and myself is called The Double Translation of Social Protection, the Role of Agents and Coercive Learning in Social Policy Diffusion in Sub-Saharan Africa. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus basically on our 2 main arguments, on our 2 major contributions, which are firstly related to our suggestion to think of policy diffusion in terms of coercive learning. And then secondly, our argument that agents matter, that is individual human beings. And I'll make a theoretical and also an empirical claim for that point. First of all, our starting point was this 4-fold concept of policy diffusion that we're all familiar with. Thinking about policy diffusion in terms of coercion, learning, emulation, and competition. And we found that because these categories are fairly blurred in practice, it might make sense to think about how they interact. And we particularly think that that coercion and learning are very insightful for understanding the diffusion of social protection policy in Africa. And therefore, we decided to look at this case of policy diffusion under the heading of coercive learning. Now, what do we mean by this? So first of all, the case study, so to say, that we look at is the diffusion of social protection policies across Africa that has taken place basically in the past 2 decades. And this coercive learning can be, explained with regards to 4 overall processes or mechanisms. The first of them is evidence building. So all these international agencies that were involved in the diffusion process around social protection in Africa have invested heavily in monitoring and evaluation of social protection programs, in particular the social cash transfers across the continent. And they have used this evidence, often in the form of statistical findings about the effectiveness of particular programs, for policy and advocacy purposes vis-à-vis African governments. Secondly, international agencies have often undertaken so-called costing analyses. So they have tried to show that actually social protection is not really so much a drain on public resources, but has to be thought of much more in terms of being an investment. So they have used these analyses to show again to governments that social protection is not only affordable, but actually has high returns. Thirdly, International agencies, such as, for instance, the World Bank and the ILO, have their own training programs for state employees. So they run courses with regards to social protection design and implementation in various sub-aspects. And of course, in these trainings, what also happens is the promotion of very specific visions of social policy, of social protection, of what it is and of how it can be achieved. And as we all know, the visions around social protection can be quite different depending on which international agency you look at. And then fourthly, and this simultaneously also captures the, if you like, success of this policy diffusion, was the contribution to shaping national social protection policies, NSPPs, in Africa. While there were none in 2000, there were 35 of them in 2019. So many countries have now adopted national social protection policies, which include a lot of different programs usually. And most of these national policies were at least co-drafted by expat agents of agencies. So we can see that agents actually matter a great deal across all of these four processes. But now the question is, how can we make sense of individual agents? And first we look at this theoretically. So drawing on particularly American pragmatism, but practice theories more widely. First of all, we say that actually individual humans are the only actors who are capable of reflexivity and abduction. And this term abduction has been coined by Pierce, an American pragmatist, and it basically describes the creative sense-making and meaning-making that we do in everyday life, as well as in research, by the way, but also in everyday problem-solving activities. So we have a certain existing stock of knowledge, and we try to apply this knowledge to what we see, to what we encounter in a given situation. And if it doesn't help us out, we have to update it, so to say. So there's always a process of creativity involved. So learning per se is an activity that actually only takes place in individual human brains, if you like. And then secondly, zooming in on individuals also enables us to look at structure and agency at the same time, or if you like, at what society brings and also at the individual part of actions. And here we can draw, for instance, on the concept of habitus by Pierre Bourdieu, or on the distinction that Mead offers us with the terms I and me. And both of them enable us to see individual practices not only for the structures that are reproduced, but also for the creativity and agency that by definition always resides in any kind of activity, in any kind of action, if you break it down. So this would be a theoretical approach to looking at individual agents in the diffusion process. And overall, we therefore say that actually what we see is a double translation process. It's not only so much the diffusion of a new policy idea, for instance, into a country by an international agency, but it's also, secondly, then the translation and the transportation of this idea by individual agents. And to substantiate this argument, or to illustrate this perspective, we then draw on the case of Zambia and the social protection regime in Zambia. The case lends itself really to this analysis, not only because both of us know it very well, but also because it has really stood out, so to speak, in the overall story of social protection in Africa. And some people might already be familiar with some of these names. Now, we have singled out 3 individual agents in this story of social protection in Zambia, not because they are the 3 most important ones or anything, but because they embody different types of agents and different types of positionality that agents can have and different roles that they can play. Let me briefly run through them. So the first one is called Bernd Schubert, a German, who was hired by the German Development Agency in 2003 to first conduct a poverty assessment in one district in southern Zambia, and then to come up with a solution, so to say. And Bernd Schubert brought in this idea of social cash transfers because he argued, given the poverty profile that he found in this district, he said actually cash transfers would be the most suitable way to address this poverty. And he brought this idea from Mozambique, where he had previously worked with cash transfers. So Schubert clearly was an outsider to Zambia. Nonetheless, he did have some connections, and he needed to have these connections with the domestic political system. So he was able to promote this idea. Then a couple of years later, another agent became influential in the social protection system in Zambia, and this was Charlotte Harland, or Charlotte Harland Scott. Charlotte Harland first came to Zambia, I think in her mid-20s or so, after studying development studies in the UK. So she's British. And then she basically stayed in Zambia up to the present day, not least because she met her future husband there, Guy Scott, who later was also served as vice president in Zambia for a while. And Charlotte Harland Scott first worked for international development agencies, and then later she worked for UNICEF, and there she became the chief social policy, which is a very influential position within UNICEF, and they work very closely with the government. And she was also closely involved in the national social protection policy. So Charlotte Harland, again, bridges, but in a different way, bridges the inside and the outside, if you like. So she came as an outsider, but then very much became an insider. And then lastly, we have Dennis Wood here, a Zambian, as far as I know, originally an agricultural specialist, who was involved in an early piece of research that was published in 2005 and funded by DFID, the Drivers of Change study on the political feasibility of social protection in Zambia. So he was then hired and paid for by donors, became one of the co-authors of this study. I think the lead author was Armando Barrientos back then. And since then, he has been very much engaged in the social protection community and discourse in Zambia. So here we have an insider with outside connections to the donor community. So all three of them cross the boundary between inside and outside, and therefore we would say they are all carriers, to use Johanna Kuhlmann et al.'s terms, and they are all carriers of diffusion, if you like. Right, and then lastly, Stephen Devereux and I have added a self-reflexive part to this paper because, you know, given that all these agents can be quite influential, even external agents, and given that all of this diffusion, in our view, has a lot to do with coercive learning processes, we think it's actually imperative to also reflect on our own role in this bigger knowledge construction process, because the lines between, or the boundaries between the academic and the policy community are actually very blurred if you think about it in the social protection discourse or social policy more widely. So we think that actually, reflecting on our own role in the diffusion processes is not only interesting to shed more light on what kind of role agents can play, but is maybe also a bit like an ethical obligation to at least take a step back and think, okay, so what kind of influence do we actually have? So 2 examples. We found that both of us actually were involved in social policy diffusion in Zambia at different stages. So we used this opportunity to think a little bit about how we, what our roles looked like as agents, and also what implications we can draw from these. So Stephen Devereux, first of all, was contracted in 2009 by the cooperating partners, how international agencies are often called in Zambia, to write a proposal for the Ministry of Community Development, which is the one implementing most of the social protection policies, including the social cash transfer, to scale up what were back then only pilot projects around the cash transfer into a national program. So the idea was to learn from these different testing grounds, if you like, test sites, to think about how can a nationwide scaled up program look. And this proposal was then supposed to be used by the ministry to submit for funding to the cooperating partners again. So what we learned from this experience is that actually these countries where ideas are diffused to also very much act as testing grounds at the same time. So new ideas are being tested and lessons are being learned. And then secondly, and that's related to the degree of influence that agents can have, in this case, there was a lot of micro-editing done by the cooperating partners who already had a specific narrative about social protection in mind that they also wanted to bring across with this particular proposal. And then secondly, looking at my own experience in Zambia as a policy diffusion agent, if you like, which took place a little later in 2017, I was contracted by another cooperating partner or international agency to carry out an assessment of a food security pack, what was called, so basically a subsidy for small-scale farmers administered by the same Ministry of Community Development. And this was then supposed to inform the reform and also the expansion of the food security pack, and also draw conclusions about possible synergies, linkages between the food security pack and the cash transfer. And two things really stood out for me in this experience. And one is that it was pretty obvious that I was able to draw on the authority that this particular agency already had, even before I began my work for them. So even though I was relatively inexperienced and quite a bit of an outsider, I was able to tap into this existing authority that the agency itself had, which otherwise would, which actually made it possible for me to give this kind of policy advice in the first place. And then secondly, it also became clear that what's needed here are multiple different types of translations. So in order for ideas to diffuse from one place to the next, and this is not only from the international to the national, but also even from, between different levels within the domestic policymaking process, different types of knowledge are understood in different places. So a big part of my job really was to, like a detective, to go around and collect all these different pieces of information, draw them together, and then also put them into a kind of format that would be understandable at the global level, at the headquarters of this particular agency. Right. Summing up, the first point that we wanted to make is very simply speaking, coercive learning shapes policy diffusion. Secondly, we think that it needs to be emphasized that agencies have agents and agents have agency. And then thirdly, and a last remark that we would like to make is that, even though we have so many passionate agents that push for social protection and that promote the ideals of social protection, this will never be able to make up for a lack of institutionalization, by which we mean the capacity of the state to not only conduct its own learning processes, for instance, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, but also in terms of carrying out its own policies in the long run. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Stephen. This was really a great paper. It was super interesting to read, especially since, you could see, and you also described this now in your presentation, that you are both real experts on the Zambian case, and also your self-reflectivity and this particular approach. It was super interesting to read. So yeah, thanks a lot for this paper. I have a few comments, and my first comment, since we are focusing on mechanisms here in this panel, is a little bit about this mechanism of coercive learning, and then also this concept of double translation that you introduced. So double translation, is also part of the title of your paper, and in your paper you do not mention it very often, and I was wondering what role this double translation exactly plays. Is it a process, or is it maybe an alternative mechanism that has a certain relationship to the other mechanism that you introduced, this coercive learning? Yeah. So my first question would be, how important is double translation as a potential second mechanism, and what's the relationship to coercive learning? And then, I think, it was super interesting to read about the role of the influential actors, and I found it particularly interesting that you highlight aspects such as the role between the national level and the international level, which might be blurred, which you show in the case of Charlotte Harland, and also how important informal aspects sometimes can be, for example, going to the same church. I think that was really interesting, and I was wondering if your description of the different actors could maybe more explicitly be linked to the theoretical assumptions that you introduced earlier, not only to the mechanisms, but also to the both aspects that you describe, the embeddedness of actors on the one hand, and then the creativity of actors on the other hand. I was wondering, if this might be possible or if this might be interesting. And then my final remark, especially in the beginning, you introduce the self-reflexive approach as a kind of methodological contribution. And I was wondering if it's really a methodological contribution or if it's maybe more than that. Not that methods are not enough, but I think this is more than a methodological contribution. And since I also found this really interesting, how you reflect on your role in shaping these social policy processes, I was wondering if maybe this could even be another paper, or if this could be moved to the center of the paper, because I feel that you have a lot of interesting aspects in this paper, and maybe maybe you could even make several papers out of it, because each aspect is so interesting. First, this notion of coercive learning and the mechanisms, then the role of individual actors, and then the self-reflexive approach. These are my comments, and thanks again for the paper. I really, really enjoyed reading it.
Yes, thanks very much, Johanna, for your reaction. I'm happy to hear that you found this interesting, of course, and I also agree that there's quite a bit that we can think about further. First of all, on your question about the relationship between these concepts of coercive learning and then the double translation, yes. I suppose taking this paper further, we also have to think about, or maybe we have to prioritize these concepts a little bit better, and see which ones really capture the essence of our paper. I think the double translation, for now, it offered a way for us to break this process down. And if we conceive of this overall process as an example of coercive learning, I think you can understand the double translation as a way to break the coercive learning down into at least 2 steps. But of course, there are many more steps if you think about it. So what we wanted to emphasize was that actually we shouldn't see these agencies as monolithic bodies that bring in an idea, and then that's the idea, and that's what governments have to work with. But actually, if you look at it more closely, because there are different individual agents involved that bring in their own interpretations and their own experiences, actually ideas become translated and change in the process. So probably if you follow this train of thoughts, you would probably arrive at least a triple translation, maybe more. Yes, and then linking our points about the individual agents back to the theoretical framework, I think this is something we probably should do going forward, yes. And exactly. So the theoretical framework points at the simultaneous kind of reproduction and alteration of structure. So we have the embeddedness of agents, in particular, for instance, professional logics. So we have people who have been maybe working for UNICEF for a number of years and have internalized the ideals and processes, structures that UNICEF promotes. At the same time, they always act based on their own interpretations and their own sense making of a given situation. But probably we could flesh this out a bit more with regards to the individual agents, yes. And one thing we also discussed already, and we might include this later in the paper, is the different degrees to which agents can actually exert creativity, and that this might also be different for different types of agencies. So for instance, the very bureaucratized UN organizations might actually leave less room for individual decisions and individual interpretations than, for instance, bilateral donors who give a little bit more leeway to their agents. But that's just, a first hypothesis, but these are the kinds of things we might think further about. And then on the self-reflexivity, so I agree, this would probably also justify a standalone paper. I think in this paper, we really wanted to test also whether it works to have this kind of self-reflexive approach. I'll have to think about whether this is mainly methodological. I mean, I think it's methodological, of course, but then also it would be nice if it could also serve as an analytical perspective, and I think it does, because it enables us to look more closely at how these translation and diffusion processes work. I'll take this on board and we'll think about it. Thank you, Johanna.
Okay, I see no comments or questions in the chat, so I think it's maybe already time to close this session. I would like to thank all presenters again, Amanda, Connie, Anna, and also Stephen, for presenting the interesting research, and also to all people who came and listened to our panel. I hope there will soon be another opportunity to meet in person and to discuss. Take care and goodbye.